In the vast legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, few figures stand shrouded in such mystery, yet carry such monumental weight as the Blue Wizards. Their names, Alatar and Pallando, echo faintly across the texts, like half-forgotten whispers of a story untold. They were not mere wanderers, nor minor characters, but Istari, emissaries of the Valar themselves. And yet, unlike Gandalf, Saruman, or Radagast, their deeds are lost to silence. Were they saviors who carried hope into distant lands, or were they failures swallowed by the darkness they sought to resist? Today, we unravel the long shadow of the Blue Wizards, those who vanished, yet whose influence may have shaped the fate of Middle-earth more than we know. Before we journey further into the story, if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, it would help us bring more tales from Arda to life. Now, let's return to the story. The tale begins with the forging of Middle-earth's defenses against Sauron. The Valar, guardians of the world, saw the growing shadow of the Dark Lord as a peril too great to leave unchecked. But they would not intervene directly, for their power, unleashed in full, would break the fragile lands they sought to protect. Instead, they sent emissaries, the Istari, wizards clothed in the frailty of men, bound by age and mortality, so that they might counsel, inspire, and lead without dominating. Of these, 5 came forth: Curunir the White, whom men would know as Saruman; Olorin the Grey, the humble wanderer called Gandalf; Eowendil, lover of beasts and birds, known as Radagast; and lastly, the 2 clad in sea blue, Alatar and Pallando. They stepped into the world not as conquerors, but as guides, tasked with nothing less than turning the tide of history. Yet from the beginning, their paths diverged. While Saruman sought knowledge in the west and Gandalf walked among the free peoples, the Blue Wizards did not linger in the heartlands of Middle-earth. They journeyed east, beyond the reach of elves and men, into lands scarcely mentioned in song or story. There, in the realms of Rhûn and beyond the halls of Harad, they faced trials that no chronicler recorded. Tolkien himself left their fates ambiguous, sometimes hinting at failure, sometimes at quiet success. In one account, they fell to darkness, founding secret cults that spread Sauron's influence rather than opposing it. Yet in later writings, Tolkien revised his view. Perhaps, he suggested, they sowed seeds of resistance in forgotten lands, weakening Sauron's dominion where no other power could reach. If this was true, then the great wars of the West might have been winnable only because of the unseen labor of these 2 vanished wizards. And so, a haunting question lingers. Were Alatar and Pallando betrayers of their mission, or were they its unsung saviors? To answer this, we must trace their journey back to Valinor, to the very moment they were chosen, and to the purpose that set them apart from their brethren. It was Curamo, Saruman, who was chosen first, proud and eager. Then Olorin, humble and reluctant, yet favored by Manwë and Varda. Eowendil came at the request of Yavanna. But the Blue Wizards were different. Alatar was selected by the hunter, Orimo, who roamed the vast, untamed lands of Middle-earth in the Elder Days. And Alatar did not come alone. He chose a companion, Pallando. From the very beginning, their mission was bound together, not solitary, but as a pair destined to walk side by side. This pairing was no accident. Unlike Gandalf or Saruman, the Blue Wizards were not sent merely to counsel. Their charge was strategic, vast, and unseen, to move beyond the Western realms and to labor in secret, undermining Sauron's allies, sowing doubt among his worshippers, and dividing the strength of the East. If they succeeded, the Dark Lord's armies would never march at their full might against Gondor in the West. If they failed, the balance of the world would tip. But what became of them after they vanished beyond the borders of familiar lands? That mystery is at the heart of our story, and its unraveling will take us through Tolkien's shifting thoughts, from the earliest sketches in the peoples of Middle-earth to the late reflections of unfinished tales and his letters. And perhaps, in following their shadowed path, we will find that the question of the Blue Wizards is not merely one of lost history, but of how fragile the line between salvation and ruin can be. The story of the Blue Wizards cannot be told without first understanding the Istari as a whole, the order of wizards who came to Middle-earth in the Third Age. They were not mortals, nor were they gods. They were Maiar, spirits of great power, akin to the Balrogs and the very servants of the Valar themselves. But where the Balrogs had become flames of terror, the Istari came clothed in humility. They were bound into the forms of old men, aged and weary, to remind them of the limits they must bear, and to keep them from lording their might over those they were sent to guide. The Valar's choice to send them was no small thing. After the ruin of Númenor, after Sauron's spirit reformed in Middle-earth, the Valar knew that the struggle against the Shadow could no longer be borne by armies of the West. Instead, subtlety and persuasion were required. The Istari were the answer, not conquerors, but teachers, counselors, and wanderers who could strengthen the hearts of elves and men without coercion. Their very restriction from using full divine power was intentional. It was a test of patience, wisdom, and restraint. And yet, within this mission, the Blue Wizards were unique. Where Gandalf, Saruman, and Radagast remained in the Western lands, dwelling in Lindon, Lorien, Rohan, and Gondor, the two in blue were tasked with something far more difficult: to go east and south into lands where Sauron's influence was strongest and where the free peoples held little sway. These regions, Rhûn and Harad, stretched vast and nearly uncharted, filled with tribes and kingdoms whose histories Tolkien only brushed with the faintest strokes. In those lands, the worship of dark powers ran deep, and the armies that would later march under Sauron's banners were forged. Here lay the heart of their mission: to divide, weaken, and delay. Tolkien, in one of his later writings, mused that had the Blue Wizards not gone east, the hosts that came to Mordor's call during the War of the Ring might have been twice as great. The Easterlings and the Southrons might have poured forth in such numbers that even the courage of Rohan and Gondor would not have been enough. Their role, then, was not to be seen in the chronicles of the West, but to be felt in the absence of overwhelming defeat. If Sauron's allies were less organized, if rebellion festered in his dominions, it may have been because two forgotten wizards labored in silence. But Tolkien's thoughts were not always so generous. In his earlier writings, the Blue Wizards were failures. He suggested they had been ensnared by the very darkness they were sent to oppose. Some versions claim they became leaders of magical cults, twisted sects that only increased the corruption of the East. In this telling, their mission was not only unsuccessful, but catastrophic, their corruption serving as a counterpoint to Gandalf's unwavering loyalty. Which of these versions holds the truth? The uncertainty reflects Tolkien's own evolving vision. In his later years, as he refined the legendarium, he seemed unwilling to leave the Blue Wizards as failures. Instead, he granted them a quiet, hidden success. Their deeds, though unrecorded, might have been decisive in ways the West would never know. This duality, failure or salvation, is at the very core of their mystery. It is also what makes their story so compelling. For Gandalf, we know his triumph. For Saruman, his betrayal. For Radagast, his retreat. But for Alatar and Pallando, the story ends not with clarity, but with a question mark. A gap in the narrative that Tolkien himself seemed unable to close. Their origins, however, give us some insight. Alatar was not chosen alone. He was handpicked by Orome, the great hunter of the Valar, who knew well the vast lands beyond the western shores. Orome was the one who first discovered Middle-earth in the Elder Days, who brought word of the elves' awakening to Valinor. It is fitting, then, that his emissary would go back to those distant, untamed realms. Alatar, embodying Orome's strength, was meant to stride far into the wilderness. And he did not go alone. He chose Pallando to accompany him, a choice that sets them apart, for no other Istar came as part of a pair. This partnership is key. Gandalf's strength was found in solitude, Saruman's in his pride, Radagast's in his retreat. But the Blue Wizards came as brothers in arms, companions with a shared destiny. In the lands of the East, their unity may have been their greatest weapon, or perhaps their downfall if one faltered and threw the other with him. And so the stage was set. 5 wizards entered Middle-earth, but only 3 remained in sight. The other 2 passed eastward, and from that moment their names faded from memory. Yet their absence left a void filled with questions. Did they fall? Did they resist? Did they sow hope where none could survive? Or did they bend their knees to the shadow? This is the enigma of the Blue Wizards, and it leads us to the heart of their disappearance. For to understand why they vanished, we must follow Tolkien's shifting perspective across decades of writing, and see how his evolving vision of Middle-earth reshaped their fate. In Tolkien's earliest conception, the fate of the Blue Wizards was bleak. In the notes that later became part of the Peoples of Middle-earth, he wrote that Alatar and Pallando journeyed into the east and south, and there they failed. Not merely in the sense of being ineffective, but in the more tragic sense of being corrupted. In this telling, they ceased to be servants of the Valar and instead became the very thing they were sent to oppose. According to these early drafts, the Blue Wizards founded secret cults among the peoples of the East. These cults blended sorcery, domination, and twisted rituals, becoming centers of dark influence that aligned with Sauron's designs. Rather than breaking his strength, they bolstered it, preparing vast nations to be marshaled under the Dark Lord's banners. If this vision were true, the Blue Wizards were not saviors, but betrayers, agents who, by their fall, ensured that countless peoples were drawn into the shadow. This version of their fate is stark when compared to Gandalf's path. Gandalf alone remained steadfast, refusing power even at the moment of victory, surrendering the ring when offered, and ultimately resisting the temptation that broke Saruman. Radagast, too, faltered, though in a lesser way, retreating from his charge to dwell among birds and beasts. But Alatar and Pallando, in this darker account, abandoned their mission entirely. They did not merely retreat into irrelevance, they actively advanced the dominion of Sauron. Such a conception paints a world where the East and South were utterly lost to darkness, their peoples condemned not only by Sauron's might, but by the treachery of those who might have freed them. It emphasizes the isolation of the West, standing alone against the storm of Mordor, with no hope of allies beyond its borders. This may have been Tolkien's intention at one point, to heighten the sense of desperation, to show that salvation came not from everywhere, but only from the courage of a few. And yet, even here, in this grim vision, there is ambiguity. Did the Blue Wizards fall willingly, seduced by power, or did they simply lose hope, entangled in the cultures and politics of vast and alien realms? Tolkien leaves no clear answer, but the fact that he wrote of them at all suggests that their story mattered deeply, even in failure. The shadow of their absence loomed large, for the armies of Easterlings and Southrons were not nameless. They were the visible proof that in the far corners of the world, Sauron's reach endured. It is telling that Tolkien later revisited this conclusion. For the older he grew, the more uneasy he seemed with the idea that the Valar's mission had failed so completely. If all but Gandalf faltered, what did that say about the wisdom of the Valar in sending them? And what did it say about the fate of countless souls in the East and South, left to darkness with no light of guidance? Thus, in later writings, a new possibility emerged. Tolkien began to imagine the Blue Wizards not as traitors, but hidden agents, whose labor, though unseen, was vital. Perhaps, he suggested, they succeeded in ways that were never recorded in the tales of the West. Perhaps their influence, though subtle, ensured that Sauron's armies were never united in full strength. Perhaps, without them, Gondor and Rohan would have been swept away long before the ring ever reached Mount Doom. This shift is remarkable because it reflects Tolkien's broader themes of hope in unexpected places and of victory through unseen sacrifice. Just as hobbits, the most unlikely of all peoples, became the key to the ring's destruction, so too might two forgotten wizards working in lands beyond the map have been decisive in weakening the Dark Lord. Yet the earlier version of their corruption was never erased entirely. It lingers like a shadow, a reminder that even the wise may fall, and that the line between salvation and ruin is razor thin. Tolkien himself never fully reconciled these two visions. Instead, he left both possibilities alive, inviting us to wrestle with the mystery. And so, the Blue Wizards stand at a crossroads of interpretation: failures who strengthened the shadow, or hidden saviors who weakened it. To explore this tension further, we must now turn to Tolkien's later reflections, particularly in Unfinished Tales and in his letters, where his thoughts on Alatar and Pallando grew more hopeful, and where he placed them in a context far larger than the War of the Ring alone. In Tolkien's later years, his imagination began to shift the destiny of the Blue Wizards away from tragedy and towards something far more subtle and perhaps far more powerful. In Unfinished Tales and his letters, he began to suggest that Alatar and Pallando were not failures at all, but silent agents of resistance, whose unseen work in the East and South made the victories of the West possible. Here, the narrative transforms. Instead of succumbing to corruption, the Blue Wizards became sowers of rebellion, undermining Sauron's dominion in lands otherwise lost to the shadow. Tolkien wrote that without them, the forces of the East and South in the War of the Ring would have been so overwhelming that the West could not have won. This is a striking reversal of their earlier portrayal. Rather than contributing to Sauron's might, they may have fractured his dominions from within, preventing him from unleashing his full strength upon Gondor and Rohan. Consider the armies that did march against the West: the Easterlings at the Battle of Dale, the Southrons who fell upon Osgiliath and Pelennor fields, the Variogs of Khand, and countless other peoples whose names are only briefly mentioned. Even as they pressed Gondor to the brink of ruin, Tolkien hints that their numbers could have been far greater. If the Blue Wizards labored in those distant lands, breaking alliances, stirring dissent, planting seeds of resistance, then their unseen efforts may have turned the tide long before the ring was destroyed. In this interpretation, Alatar and Pallando embody one of Tolkien's deepest themes, that the most important deeds are often those left unrecorded. Just as the Hobbit's quiet resilience changed the course of history, so too might two forgotten wizards wandering nameless among faraway tribes have shaped the destiny of the world. Their absence from the chronicles of Gondor and Rivendell does not diminish their importance, it reinforces it. For their work was never about glory or recognition, but about ensuring that the free peoples of Middle-earth had a fighting chance. This later vision also broadens the scope of the war against Sauron. Too often, readers focus only on the battles of the West: Helm's Deep, Pelennor Fields, the Black Gate. But in truth, Sauron's shadow stretched far beyond Mordor. His dominion reached deep into Rhûn, Harad, and beyond, where whole civilizations bent the knee to his will. In such vast realms, the Blue Wizards may have labored for centuries, never known to the West, but no less vital in the struggle. And yet, even here, Tolkien leaves them cloaked in mystery. Did they inspire uprisings that fractured Sauron's armies? Did they spread secret knowledge that resisted his worship? Did they build hidden networks of allies, forgotten in the histories of elves and men, but remembered in whispers by distant peoples? The texts never say. What remains is the tension between failure and salvation. What is certain, however, is that Tolkien no longer saw them as mere footnotes. By granting them a hidden but decisive role, he elevated their story into one of the great unseen labors of Middle-earth, an echo of his larger vision of providence, where even the smallest and most overlooked actions carry cosmic weight. This reinterpretation also casts new light on the nature of the Istari themselves. Gandalf, in the West, embodied humility and wisdom in plain sight. Saruman embodied pride and corruption. Radagast embodied retreat from responsibility. But the Blue Wizards embodied endurance, working far from recognition, without thanks, in a place where the darkness was strongest. Their story reminds us that victory in Tolkien's world was never won by strength alone, but persistence, faith, and sacrifice, unacknowledged. In this sense, Alatar and Pallando become archetypes of hidden hope. Their names vanish from the songs of the West, but their impact may linger in every victory sung in Gondor's halls. For without them, the great battles we know might never have been won at all. Yet Tolkien's reluctance to pin down their final fate also reflects another truth, that Middle-earth was never meant to be a perfectly finished tapestry. It was a mythology in motion, alive with shifting perspectives and half-finished tales. The Blue Wizards stand as a testament to that living myth, existing both as failures and as saviors, depending on which page we turn. And so, the mystery deepens. What kind of world emerges if we read the Blue Wizards as betrayers? And what kind if we read them as saviors? The difference reshapes the entire history of Middle-earth and the very way we understand the War of the Ring. If we accept the darker version of their fate, that Alatar and Pallando fell into corruption, then the history of Sauron's wars takes on a chilling new clarity. Their failure would explain why the East and South, vast lands beyond the reach of Gondor, poured forth endless hosts to swell the armies of Mordor. It would mean that the Valar's mission, meant to weaken the Shadow, instead reinforced it. The cults they supposedly founded might have entrenched Sauron's worship across entire nations, binding them not merely with fear, but with devotion. In this version of history, the sheer numbers of Easterlings and Southrons that came to fight at Sauron's side were not an accident of geography. They were the consequence of betrayal. From this perspective, the war in the West looks almost miraculous in its endurance. Gondor's decline across the centuries, the endless battles with Harad, the invasions from Rhûn, these were not merely distant conflicts, but the fruit of the Blue Wizards' fall. If they had succeeded, Gondor might have had allies in the East instead of enemies. If they had remained faithful, the balance of power might have shifted entirely. The West could have stood unchallenged, and the War of the Ring might never have reached such desperate stakes. But if we turn instead to the later vision, where the Blue Wizards succeeded in ways unrecorded, the same history is seen through a different lens. Suddenly, the vast armies of the East and South are not proof of failure, but of partial success. For even with all those forces, Sauron was not able to overwhelm the West entirely. The Easterlings fought in Dale, the Southrons at Pelennor, but their numbers were not limitless. Tolkien himself remarked that without the Blue Wizards, their hosts might have been immeasurably greater. This reframes the War of the Ring as a conflict not fought by Gondor and Rohan alone, but as the culmination of a much broader struggle, with resistance burning quietly across the map. While Aragorn led the dead to Peligir, while Theoden rode at dawn to Minas Tirith, while Frodo and Sam crept through the desolation of Mordor, countless unnamed peoples far away may have been rebelling, resisting, or delaying Sauron's will, planted by the hands of Alatar and Pallando. The truth is that both versions, failure and success, tell us something essential about Tolkien's world. The darker version speaks to the reality of loss and corruption, that even the wise may falter, and that evil is often aided most by betrayal from within. The later version speaks to the quiet endurance of hope, the idea that no corner of the world is beyond redemption, and that even forgotten labor can tip the scales of history. What makes the Blue Wizards so fascinating is that Tolkien left both possibilities alive, never settling on one. They are both betrayers and saviors, depending on which draft you read. They are both the reason the West nearly fell, and the reason it endured at all. And in that paradox lies their power as myth. For just as real history is shaped by uncertainties, by lost stories, and by the deeds of those forgotten, so too is Middle-earth shaped by shadows and mysteries we may never resolve. This tension also reminds us of the fragility of victory in Tolkien's legendarium. The War of the Ring was not won by overwhelming force, but by a razor's edge of chance, courage, and quiet resistance. Remove one piece from that fragile puzzle, the Hobbit's stubbornness, Faramir's mercy, Éowyn's defiance, or perhaps the Blue Wizard's unseen labors, and the world might have fallen. And so, when we think of the War of the Ring, we can not only think of Gondor, Rohan, or the Shire. We must also think of Rhûn and Harad, of the distant lands where two cloaked figures may have walked for centuries, laboring without glory. Were they forgotten failures or silent heroes? The answer remains elusive, but in the silence lies one of Tolkien's greatest gifts, the space for mystery, the sense that history stretches beyond what is told. As we press further, we must turn to the larger question of why Tolkien left their fate unresolved. For in his decision not to finalize their story, he reveals something about his philosophy of myth-making itself. How uncertainty can carry as much meaning as certainty. Tolkien was a perfectionist, always refining, rewriting, and reshaping the histories of Middle-earth. Yet he was also a myth-maker, and myth is never finished. It lives in fragments, in songs half-remembered, in tales distorted by distance. To leave the Blue Wizards unresolved was not negligence. It was consistent with his larger vision of how legend works. For in the oldest myths of our own world, there are always figures who vanish, deeds half-told, names remembered without stories to anchor them. The Blue Wizards carry that same weight of mystery, embodying the silences that make a mythology feel alive. Tolkien often spoke of his legendarium as a mythology for England, though it grew into something far wider. A mythology does not explain everything. It hints, suggests, and leaves gaps for the imagination. By leaving the fate of Alatar and Pallando uncertain, whether as corrupt failures or hidden saviors, Tolkien allowed Middle-earth to breathe with the same mystery as the ancient sagas that inspired him. There is also a deeper thematic resonance in their ambiguity. The Blue Wizards are, in a sense, a mirror of choice itself. They stand at a crossroads where either outcome is possible: betrayal or fidelity, ruin or redemption. Their unresolved story reminds us that the line between falling and standing is fragile, and that history is often shaped by which side of that line we happen to tread. Gandalf himself declared, "Even the wise cannot see all ends." The Blue Wizards embody that truth. Their ends cannot be seen, even by us, the readers. Another reason Tolkien may have left their story open lies in his reluctance to moralize too narrowly. In his letters, he often resisted reducing Middle-earth into simple allegory. The Blue Wizards' ambiguity resists easy answers. If they failed, then evil's reach was extended not just by Sauron, but by those who should have resisted him. If they succeeded, then much of the free people's victory depended on labors never sung in Gondor's halls. Either way, the lesson is profound. History is always larger than the part we can see. And perhaps most importantly, the unresolved fate of the Blue Wizards invites participation. Readers, scholars, and fans have debated their role for decades precisely because Tolkien never told us what to think. That act of leaving space for interpretation, speculation, and wonder, is part of what makes Middle-earth so enduring. The gaps are not flaws, but doorways. Each unanswered question sparks 100 possible imaginings, each one drawing us deeper into the legendarium. Their ambiguity also serves a narrative function. The Istari were meant to be reflections of different possibilities. Saruman shows how wisdom can decay into pride. Gandalf shows how humility can grow into greatness. Radagast shows how devotion to nature can lead to neglect of duty. The Blue Wizards, in their mystery, show us the unknown, the outcomes we cannot measure, the histories we cannot read. They complete the circle by representing the silence of lost tales. This aligns with one of Tolkien's most profound ideas, the concept of eucatastrophe, the sudden turn to joy that arrives unexpectedly. In some versions, the Blue Wizard's quiet labor becomes just such a hidden eucatastrophe. Though unseen, their work may have weakened Sauron's power enough for Frodo's quest to succeed. That they are never mentioned in the Songs of Victory only deepens the point. Joy and salvation often come through unheralded sacrifice. At the same time, the darker vision that they failed serves as a warning that even divine missions can falter, and that victory is never inevitable. This tension between despair and hope, failure and hidden triumph, runs through all of Tolkien's writings. The Blue Wizards carry that tension perfectly. So, why did Tolkien leave their fate unresolved? Perhaps because in myth, some doors must remain closed. Mystery has its own power. The very fact that we cannot know whether Alatar and Pallando fell or stood keeps their story alive. If Tolkien had tied it neatly with one answer, the Blue Wizards might have become just another footnote. Instead, they remain one of the great enigmas of Arda, a story half told, a thread forever dangling at the edge of the tapestry. And in that silence, they become immortal. The mystery of the Blue Wizards leads us inevitably to the peoples of the East and South, the Easterlings, the Haradrim, the men of Khand, those countless nations who fought and died under Sauron's banners. To Gondor, to Rohan, and to the Shire, they were enemies, faceless hordes pouring across the plains in service of the Dark Lord. But Tolkien himself hinted that this was never the whole story. He admitted in his letters that the histories we read in The Lord of the Rings are told from the perspective of the West, written by the victors. The men of the East and South had their own cultures, their own loyalties, and perhaps their own struggles against the shadow. It is here that the Blue Wizards matter most. For if they failed, then the darkness of Sauron swept those peoples without resistance, binding entire civilizations to his will. Their loyalty to Mordor would have been complete, leaving no space for rebellion. But if the Blue Wizards succeeded, even partially, then those peoples were not wholly lost. Seeds of defiance may have been planted, alliances fractured, cults broken. The Haradrim and Easterlings who fought at Pelennor Fields might have been only a fraction of those who could have come, had Alatar and Pallando not worked quietly in the shadows. This dual possibility, failure or success, reshapes how we view the War of the Ring. It reminds us that the West's victory was never inevitable, but fragile, balanced on choices both seen and unseen. Gondor's survival may have depended not only on Aragorn's courage or Frodo's endurance, but also on forgotten deeds carried out far from Minas Tirith or the Shire. The nameless labor of the Blue Wizards becomes part of the hidden scaffolding of history, a reminder that victory is never the work of a single hand. Their enigma also expands the moral scope of Tolkien's world. Too often, we think of Middle-earth in simple terms, West against East, light against shadow. But the fate of the Blue Wizards and the forgotten lives they touched complicates that picture. If they failed, then we see how easily even divine messengers can fall and how deeply corruption can spread. If they succeeded, then we glimpse the universality of hope, the idea that no land, however dark, is beyond redemption. And perhaps that is why Tolkien left their story unresolved. By refusing to give us certainty, he forced us to hold both truths in tension, the despair of failure and the hope of unseen victory. This tension is the heartbeat of his mythology. In the end, Middle-earth was not saved by overwhelming power, but by small acts of endurance, by hidden resistance, and by hope that refused to die, even in the darkest corners of the world. The Blue Wizards, then, are not simply a puzzle for lore keepers. They are symbols of the unseen. They remind us that history is always larger than what we can see, that countless labors go unremembered, and that sometimes the greatest saviors are those whose names are lost. Whether they fell into shadow or stood against it, their absence is itself a kind of presence, shaping the legendarium in silence. And so, their story ends as it began, in mystery. Two figures in sea blue robes, walking eastward, fading from the chronicles of elves and men. Saviors who vanished, yet whose absence may have shaped the very fate of the world. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.